Today on Basic Bytes, we are peeking inside the Commodore 1571 floppy disk drive, and as I rebuild this unit, I will be commenting on parts of interest and how you can keep yours humming along ship-shape. Greetings, it's JC at Basic Bytes, and today we are peeking inside the Commodore 1571 5¼ floppy disk drive. This is our second peek inside video on Basic Bytes, and much like the previous one that I released about the MPS 802 printer, this video is not going to contain any long segments of me doing troubleshooting or repairs or soldering montages. Rather, I'm going to take a unit that I have already finished refurbishing and rebuild it for you layer by layer, and as we get to each subsequent layer, I will comment on parts of interest and also give you tips on general maintenance. That way, if there is a part or section of this device that does not interest you, you can easily skip forward to the next section, and if you have any comments on this format, feel free to leave one. I'm not going to get too far into the specifications of the 1571 here because that's not what this video is about, and presumably if you're watching this you already know something about this drive. However, for brief introduction, I will say that this was the floppy disk drive that was marketed alongside the Commodore 128, and it's a great analog to that machine. Much like the 128 was a Swiss Army knife of a computer that could operate in 128 mode, Commodore 64 mode, or CP/M mode, the 1571 disk drive could similarly read dual-sided 1571 formatted disks, single-sided 1541 formatted disks, and could also read MFM formatted disks, which is what CP/M needed versus the Commodore formats, which were GCR encoded. That is by no means to say that the 1571 was strictly a disk drive for the Commodore 128. Not at all. This device could operate in both 1571 and 1541 modes, and indeed could be connected to any of the Commodore machines to which you could hook up a Commodore 1541. However, the greatest selling points certainly were for Commodore 128 users. If you had a 128 in 128 mode, it could signal the 1571 automatically to run in fast serial mode, which would finally provide decent transfer speeds over the serial bus from your floppy drive without the need for any sort of a fast loader cartridge. Thus, if you were a Commodore 128 user, even if you were only using floppy diskettes formatted in 1541 format, there was excellent motivation for you to want one of these. For Commodore 64 users, there is actually a disinclination towards purchasing the 1571 drive. Sure, it will work, and yes, you can use it to format a double-sided floppy diskette if you have any need for such a thing. However, the fast serial transfer capabilities of the 1571 will not work with the C64. It will start up in 1541 mode by default, and 1541 mode is not guaranteed to be 100% compatible with an actual 1541. It's only mostly and generally compatible. And due to the relative rarity of the 1571s today versus the 1541s, the same thing holds true in the present as it did in 1985, namely that for a Commodore 64 user, the 1571 by and large is a more expensive 1541 drive that may end up being less compatible than an actual 1541. So with that, let's get inside of her. We'll begin with the shells, although there isn't a great deal to see here. This is the internal of the bottom shell, and one of the great things about this design is that everything unscrews very neatly and easily in the event that you have an old unit for which the shells need a good cleaning, which is the state that this one was in when it came to me. The one piece of advice I will give is look out for what size of screw you are pulling out from what standoff. Some of the internals screw in with larger screws and some with smaller ones, and you don't want to be screwing the wrong length screw into the wrong hole. The top shell simply sits on top of the bottom shell and gets screwed in with 4 screws from the bottom, and as for the front faceplate, it does not have any screws whatsoever attaching it to the main unit. There are simply 4 clips that hold it in place when both the top and bottom shell are in place. And if you are indeed removing internals for cleaning, there are 2 screws on the LED PCB that let you cleanly remove that. And of course, the final piece is the little drive lever, which simply pushes on and pulls off the mechanism. So this is the brain of the 1571, of course, the mainboard, which attaches into the bottom case with 4 screws, one of which is not in here right now because this particular screw hole attaches to a grounding cable which attaches to the motor assembly, and having it sticking up here might be a bit of an obstruction during this portion of the video. In addition to having this board out for the cleaning of the shells, I just finished recapping it, and what that means is I replaced the old electrolytic capacitors that were on this board with new ones. There are only 4 small value electrolytic capacitors on this board, making it a very easy job, and I am a big believer in recapping once capacitors hit a certain age. They are supposed to have a projected shelf life of about 15 years, whereas the ones on this board were pushing 35, and I have seen recapping in the case of retro computers solve a wide variety of bizarre issues which weren't on the level of an outright fault, but was nonetheless creating some sort of an odd instability within the system. I'm not going to get too far into the technical weeds when it comes to this circuit board, as that really isn't the purpose of this video, and for those that are really interested in electronics, the 1571 service manual with all of the schematics can be freely downloaded, and you can take a look at those. However, there are 4 chips on this board that were actually made by Commodore. Those are of special interest, and one of them in particular should be of great interest to every single owner of a 1571 disk drive. So, let me briefly explain the other 3 first. This MOS 8521 Revision 0 is a CIA chip. It is in fact just a version of the same 6526 CIA chip that is inside your Commodore 64 and 128, which handles I/O. In the cases of those computers, it handles things like joystick and keyboard input. The next chip is your MOS 6502 microprocessor. The 1571, just like the 1541, is a complete 6502 driven computer in and of its own right. This one down here, which is barely readable, is a 251828 Mark 01 gate array, and all a gate array is a whole bunch of logic gates on a chip custom created by Commodore. And now we come to the chip that every single owner of a 1571 disk drive should concern himself with, and that is the 310654 ROM chip. This ROM chip contains all the code for your disk operating system, or DOS. you will note that the operating system in your Commodore 64 or 128 is often referred to as the kernel and not as DOS, because these disk drives, being intelligent computing peripherals on their own, have their own DOS on board, and what version of that DOS you have on the 1571 is of great importance. Now, everyone who has a 1571 will have a 310654 chip in this slot, but if it's a -03 version, as is in here, you are going to want to replace that with a -05 version, as I would like to do with this drive, if you can actually find an 05, and that's an issue I'll talk about in a moment. The 05 ROM for the 1571 was released by Commodore right at the end of 1986, and it fixed an extensive list of bugs that existed in the 03 ROM. Granted, some of those bugs were rather esoteric, but several of them were glaring errors, including the infamous save with replace bug that plagued the 1541 drives up until that point as well, which Commodore couldn't quite pin down or necessarily even verify the existence of. By the way, if you're wondering why the numbers jump from 03 to 05, there was in fact an 04 ROM released, but it was only released internally at Commodore. Internal developer memos show that within days of releasing the 04 ROM, which fixed all the various bugs in the 03 ROM, they in the process managed to introduce a new bug, which was then fixed before it was then released to the public as the 05 ROM. There are sites on the internet, and I believe Zimmer's is one of them, that actually has what appears to be a dump of the 04 ROM, but again, the 04 is a bug fix with a new internal error introduced. For consumer purposes, there's the 03 and the 05, and you want to get an 05. And I would also like an 05 ROM, obviously to upgrade this 1571 right here, but at this moment, I have no idea where to obtain one from, and if you know any retro computer vendor who is selling EEPROMs burned with the 05 ROM for a 1571, please leave a comment for my benefit and anyone else that may be watching. A quick sidebar that you can determine what ROM you have simply by writing a short basic program to query the drive, such as in this example from retroisle.com. This is running in Vice Emulator, which, predictably, is using the new ROM. Moving on from that, and from this, my final piece of advice regarding the mainboard is pay especial attention to all of the pin connectors and where they are orientated in terms of where pin 1 is. Most of the connectors actually are keyed in that there's a labeled pin 1 on the board, and there's also a labeled pin 1 on the connector. You may need a magnifying glass to see it, but it's there. Or if the connector doesn't have a number 1 on it, it may have a little arrow on it, and that little arrow is indicating where pin 1 is. However, be very sure when you are unplugging those connectors that the pin 1 on the connector does in fact align with the pin 1 on the mainboard. Factories do make mistakes, and there's one connector on my board which proves that, and that is the connector for the LEDs on the front panel is actually wired in backwards. So if I actually connect that connector with pin 1 of the connector to where pin 1 on the PCB is, on my particular drive, the LEDs are reversed and the power light comes on when the drive light should be on, and vice versa. Now, thankfully, that's not a reversal that's going to cause any damage to anything, as other connector reversals could certainly do, but it does reinforce that you should be checking that pin 1 on your connector is pin 1 on your board as you're unplugging it. And if you have any concerns about getting them back on in the correct orientation, just take a permanent marker and put a marker line on the connector through the connector onto the board so that you know when you're replugging those connectors in that the marker simply aligns with wherever the other mark is, and that way there's not a chance that you're accidentally going to reverse something on this board and damage it. The next thing I want to talk about is the internal power supply, and this is where we get into some dangerous stuff. The fact that this is an internal power supply means that you have the full 120 volts AC from your wall outlet coming into the disk drive right here. Inside the power supply is where the voltage conversions from AC to DC, etc. happen, and then on the other side, you have this 4-pin connector which outputs both the 5 volts and 12 volts DC needed by the mainboard and chips and motors inside the 1571 drive. So, given that the 1571 has an internal power supply, you should always make sure that the drive is off and unplugged at any point in time that you are working on it, that you have the shells open, and that goes double if at any point in time you are opening this power supply and have this protective casing off it. However, I'm about to show you the internals of this because there is, in fact, a valid reason why a home user would need to get inside here, and we'll talk about that in a minute. This is my 1571's power supply board. I have seen photos of another version that has a much larger transformer on it, and perhaps that version is prevalent in the countries that use 240 volts AC. However, I'm not really sure what the governing factor for that is. This particular board is made by Mitsumi, who also makes the mechanical internals of my 1571 disk drive. Internal disk drive power supplies get a bad rap due to the 1541 and its fist-sized power transformer and large voltage regulators which put out so much heat that they slowly bake the drive. However, the internal power supply for the 1571, noting that it has a much smaller transformer, is actually quite a bit cooler and more efficient and does not carry the same heat problems as the early 1541s did. That said, would I prefer that the 1571 had an external power brick which was openable and serviceable in the similar fashion to the power brick that came with the Commodore 128? Yes, and on a note of interest, Commodore actually planned to make a 1571 Mark II drive which used the same external power brick as the 1541 Mark II and the 1581. In fact, most of those bricks say 1571 Mark II right on them. However, that drive never got produced. Aside from making the 1571 have a larger footprint than necessary, though, I really don't have any complaints about this power supply. It is entirely serviceable in its current fashion, and in fact, I have just completed, as with the mainboard, recapping this power supply and replacing all of the electrolytic capacitors on this PCB. There is one high voltage capacitor on this board and 5 on the other side of the transformer on the low voltage side of the board, and seeing the internal power supply, I really wanted to get the 35-year-old ones replaced with new, modern, high-quality, long-life 105-degree rated capacitors because computer systems are very much garbage in, garbage out, and if you aren't supplying them with good, clean power from that point forward, the rest of the system is simply fighting an uphill battle. There are two things on this power supply, other than if you are recapping, of course, that are user adjustable and or serviceable. The first one is right down here near the AC wires. There is a 125 volt 2 amp fuse on this board. That is a cheap out by Commodore because if you recall, the 1541 drives with internal power supplies do in fact have a fuse carrier that's routed to the back of the drive and much more easily accessible. However, if you have a 1571 that is not registering any power at all, it could be that your power supply simply needs a new fuse. The second user adjustable component is this little blue variable resistor right at the back here that can be turned with a screwdriver, which I haven't moved on mine, but I assume is for fine-tuning the voltage output of this power supply, which, if you are the average user and not electronically inclined, you probably don't want to and should not touch that. However, if you are electronically inclined, the 4-pin connector at the back outputs both 5 volts and 12 volts. However, you don't ever want to hook up a multimeter directly to a power supply to measure whether its voltage is in spec, because every power supply's voltage is going to drop when it's put under load, and it's going to drop to a different degree depending upon the load and the power supply. So if you are measuring the output voltage, measuring under load at the processor is probably the best way to check whether or not your 5 volts is outputting accurately. And again, just in case you skipped the previous section of this video, a reminder that anytime you are working in here, you make certain that your 1571 is both off and unplugged. With its casing restored, the internal power supply has now been reinstalled into the bottom shell using the 4 appropriate screws. Its power connector has been plugged back into the mainboard in the correct orientation. On the other side, there are ground wires coming from both the mainboard and the power supply, both of which will be screwed onto the mechanical assembly, which is coming next. This bright, shiny, alien-looking piece of technology right here is the entire mechanical assembly from the 1571 disk drive, which attaches and removes with, you guessed it, 4 screws. Everything that a user will routinely concern himself with in terms of keeping his drive cleaned and lubricated is contained right here. I mentioned earlier that this was labeled as being a Mitsumi product, the same as the power supply, and that is true, but I will also point out that on the label here, it's co-branded between Mitsumi and Nutronics. I'm not sure if those are exactly the same company or if one handed off the parts to the other for construction. However, these mechanisms, when you read about them in manuals and such, are often referred to as Nutronics mechanisms. Another company called Alps also commonly made mechanisms for drives such as the 1541, and I believe the Alps mechanisms are the ones that have the slot that gets pushed down to close rather than the lever that turns. I'm not sure if Alps ever made a mechanism for the 1571, so this may or may not look like every other 1571 mechanism out there. Flipping over to the bottom, you see this large turntable disc here, which is in fact the motor which turns your diskette at 300 RPM. And that is my major point of praise for this design, because that is a direct drive motor, meaning this is the motor itself that is turning the diskette. On many of the 1541 models, it is not a direct drive motor, but rather the motor is being driven by a rubber drive belt in the mechanism. Rubber drive belts, of course, stretch out and eventually wear out, and when that happens, at that point, where do you get another one for a 30-plus-year-old disk drive? I have no idea. Having a direct drive motor, as also exists in my later model 1541 Mark II drives, completely alleviates you from ever having to worry about that particular point of maintenance. Of course, there's a gripe, and that is that all of the little capacitors that would have otherwise been on a topside motor control board are now in fact located on this underside PCB to which the drive motor is actually attached. And while one can easily enough remove this metal plate here, upon doing so, one discovers that this PCB is apparently screwed in from the top side, which means that if one wants to recap this board for future-proofing, it appears to me that it's necessary to disassemble this entire mechanical unit from the top down, and that is generally a task to be avoided unless it's absolutely necessary, because the 1571 contains several little sensors which, if they end up being offset from their factory calibrated position upon reassembly, can cause all sorts of issues with the operation of your drive. So, needless to say, I did not recap this PCB because once you cross the line where further disassembly could be a detriment to the device, you are firmly in the territory of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. My hope is that when I get this drive back together and run some tests on it, that I see this spinning at or near the 300 RPM that is needed for this drive to be in spec. Otherwise, you may soon see another video of me disassembling this entire mechanism. And before we put the whole thing back together, it is finally time to talk about general maintenance. And since this typically does not involve removing the mechanical assembly from its casing, I have reinstalled it. There are 4 screws into the bottom shell. There are 4 connectors into the mainboard which need to be reconnected in their proper orientation, and there are 2 ground cables, one from the PSU and one from the mainboard, which attach to a screw back here. The Commodore 1571 User's Guide is its own book, which is recommended reading in multiple respects. If you don't have a physical copy, it can be freely downloaded as a PDF online. And here's what it has to say in regards to general maintenance. On page 7, simple maintenance tips. Number 1, keep the drive well ventilated. Number 2, use Commodore diskettes. Thanks for the upsell, Commodore. And number 3, the 1571 should be cleaned once a year in normal use. And this certainly still holds true today, even though we may not be using them in normal use as our everyday machines anymore, because so many old floppy disks have been stored in less than ideal circumstances, and you'll find that they have a higher probability of depositing residue on the heads of your drive than they did back in the 80s. So I've even found that in some cases there's visible residue on the heads of a lightly used 1541 after only a few months, and that is just due to the nature of the floppy disks that have been used in that drive. Continuing on with number 3, we get into the meat and potatoes of the matter. Several items are likely to need attention. The 2 read write heads may need cleaning with 91% isopropyl alcohol on a cotton swab. The rails along which the head moves may need lubrication with a special molybdenum lubricant, say that 5 times fast, not oil. And the right protect sensor may need to be dusted. Also, right at the bottom, important, home repair of the 1571 will void your warranties. So, being the responsible producer that I am, I will be the first one to tell you that if your 1571 is still under warranty, you may disregard this entire video. So let's practically demonstrate the 2 main things that were talked about there, namely cleaning the heads and cleaning and lubricating the rails. For the head cleaning, they recommended 91% isopropyl alcohol. Really, anything 90% plus is what you're aiming for. I personally use 99. The 70% or even 60% stuff that you get at the dollar store is simply not going to cut it. It has too much water content in it, and you don't want to be introducing moisture into your electronic mechanisms. The 1571 as a dual-headed drive has 2 read and write heads right under here, one on the top and one on the bottom. In order to clean them, you simply take your isopropyl on a cotton-tipped applicator and insert from the side to clean. You may, while cleaning the bottom head, if you need more clearance, gently lift the top up just ever so slightly. You never want to bend it back in order to overtax the spring, which is very important for correct operation. Then, when cleaning the bottom is done, you wet the other side of the applicator, come on in and put ever so slight downward pressure and use that to clean the head on the top. In terms of the rails, although they are somewhat obscured from the view of the camera, there are two clearly visible metal rails right underneath this section here, along which the head mechanism clearly moves back and forth. Those rails should have the old lubricant cleaned off and new lubricant applied on an annual schedule regardless. However, if you have the drive open for any reason, it's a good idea just to test moving the head back and forth. The head should easily glide back and forth. It should not be difficult to move, nor should it be initially difficult to move. If you are feeling resistance as you move it, or if you need to initially apply quite a bit of force to get it to move, that is an indication that the rails need re-lubrication and that the drive is otherwise struggling to get its head from track to track. For cleaning the rails before applying new lubricant, you similarly use 90% plus isopropyl alcohol on a cotton applicator. You would move the head all the way to the front, clean the sections of the metal rails that are visible, and then move it all the way to the back, and then clean the remaining segments of the rails with the alcohol. New lubricant can then be applied in the exact same manner, with the head moved all the way one way and cotton swabbed onto the visible segments of the rails, then moved all the way the other way and swabbed onto the other half of the rails, then moved back and forth several times to ensure that everything is moving smoothly. As for what lubricant to use, my personal strong recommendation is MOLYKOTE EM30L, which is specifically designed for exactly this sort of application. It is regarded as being safe for metal on metal, metal on plastic, and plastic on plastic applications. And that really is the key thing here, because although the rails themselves that you are lubricating are metal, the components of the head that are riding on those rails is plastic, and probably the reason why the manual says don't use oil is that some lubricants which are oil-based can actually deteriorate plastics over time. To me, keeping a jar of the MOLYKOTE on hand is a really good investment if you have even a couple of drives that you want to keep maintained and running well into the future, and especially if you have other electronics that have plastic on metal moving parts or small plastic gears. Of course, there are other options. Some people do use silicone-based lubricants, and it has also been reported that others have used a good quality sewing machine oil dabbed onto a cotton applicator in very small amounts and lightly brushed onto the rails with good results. The two things that should go without saying, but I will say them anyway, is if you are using a lubricant that comes in an aerosol can, always spray it onto a cotton-tipped applicator and use that. Don't try to control the spray into the mechanism. You don't want excess lubricant getting into parts of the drive where it shouldn't be, such as onto your heads and sensors. And do not, under any circumstances, use WD-40 in any form. It apparently still needs saying that WD-40 is not a lubricant, it is a protectant, and all you're going to end up doing, probably, is gumming up your disk drive. Regardless of what you're using, if you do have a synthetic grease-type lubricant such as the MOLYKOTE, it is worth dabbing some on several other parts in here where you have, for example, a metal-on-metal slide, or you have the plastic head gliding along this rail, or you have the lever gliding along a small Teflon part right here in front. All you need is a very small amount on a cotton applicator, and it will keep all of those other mechanical parts gliding smoothly for insertion and ejection of disks. And there she is with her shells back on, the Commodore 1571 disk drive, recapped, cleaned, and ready to go. Time for a smoke test. And will wonders never cease? Even the correct LED comes on. Well, that's it for me. I'm looking forward to getting this thing home and running some tests with it. If you found this interesting or entertaining, please like and subscribe to Basic Bytes for more. You can also find us at basicbytes.ca. Thank you for watching.